Welcome to Ty's Daily Market Update. I'm Ty Wong reporting from New York, and it is Wednesday, July 15th. Biggest piece of news of the day, PPI came out down 0.3% in June versus a consensus of 0. Again, this is, headline is going to be, a lot of energy. Core PPI only up 0.2 versus 0.4 consensus. So that's, definitely good news 2 days in a row. Ex-food and energy and trade also pretty subdued. In addition to yesterday, certainly gives the Fed time to, consider what will come in. July is really off the table. I can't see them doing it really in September either, unless something goes dramatically, different over the next couple of months. In terms of the weeklies, crude oil stocks, a draw, but not as big as consensus. Gasoline, a little bit bigger of a draw than consensus, but a big build in diesel and heating oil, which is good news certainly for truckers. Now, just basically 2 in a row. PPI inflation slowed in large part to a 12% drop in gasoline prices. We're going to retrace some of that, maybe a quarter of that, so far, a little less. We'll have to see how that runs through the rest of the month. Broad-based cooling in several categories. And then energy prices fell 6.4% overall. That's with the biggest drop in gasoline, while transportation and warehouse prices also declined. Food prices fell for the first time in 3 months, been climbing this year. This is good news for the administration as it heads into the midterms. And, several components of PPI are of particular interest to the Fed because it feeds into the PCE. PCE is going to be out usually the last week of the month. Now, Bloomberg Economics says we calculate that PCE inflation will be firmer than June's soft CPI report, but likely still cool enough to keep the Fed on hold for at least its next few meetings. So, July hiked after today's data and yesterday's data. Chances of a July hike are down to 12%. I mean, there's really no chance of a move. If you want to make a small, make a bet that there'll be no move in July, I think that's pretty safe. We moved to September. September was 58% yesterday after the weaker CPI report. And then now it's down to 50-50. That is still too high. It is really hard to see how they're going to move in September. Okay, Korea, we looked at this chart yesterday and I thought, this candle looks like it's probably going to suggest that we're ready for a bounce, this, sort of a hammer, at the end of this long decline. And, we got a 6% bounce. Let's see if it has legs today and tomorrow. Okay, S&P 500, up 0.2%. Most has been around unchanged, up a little bit today. SK is down, 10% after yesterday's huge move higher. Now, bonds are rallying for the second straight day, really more in the front than in the back, and that's brought the dollar lower for a second straight day. You know what? Metals have not been able to take advantage of it. Gold is just unchanged, popped a little bit on the PPI number, but not impressive, and silver is actually lower. Crude oil down for the first time in a couple days. So crypto, though quietly, is doing pretty well. As for earnings, we had ASML, that's the big Dutch maker of the lithography machines that the TSMC and SK and Samsung really need to make their, and Micron need to make their chips. They had a pretty good report, beat in earnings as well as revenues are up almost 1%. Johnson & Johnson beat just a little bit and the market's punishing it, down 2%. Morgan Stanley had a very solid quarter, not as solid as, I suppose, not as blow your doors off as Goldman. So they're up a little less than 1%. Meanwhile, BlackRock has done very well. I guess the market really likes it. They're up 6.5% and a big gap higher. In the meantime, we're waiting for United Airlines. That'll be after the close. I just want to see, how well they're doing or not, if people are flying. So let's look at this chart. We're up a little bit from yesterday's close, like 0.2%. And, communication services, which are basically Google and Meta, are up, so they're leading, but technology generally down. So semiconductors is generally down. So, kind of right in the middle. Now, I don't trust this price action, and here's why. Over the last couple of days, we've got some very good news. Subdued inflation, CPI and PPI. Korea is up and bouncing, and we had very strong earnings yesterday from the banks and strong earnings today. We're not very much higher. Now, you can say we're not far from the highs, right? 76.20 is the high. We're at 75.60. We're less than 1% from the highs. But with this much good news, I really, would have liked to have seen this index push higher, at least impulsively. We're not seeing that. So is the market just too concerned about other things? What could they be concerned about? Well, sorry, I just want to take a quick look before we get to that. SK Hynix ADRs were trading at 1.40% premium to local shares. And I think that's why SK is down today. People are buying local shares, figuring out a way to sell the ADRs. I mean, it's a big arb if you can do it. I think it's relatively not complex and not too straightforward, so very hard for somebody like me to do, but if you can do it, I mean, those are big numbers. The other thing I saw was global markets investors, the Samsung, SK, and their leveraged ETFs are now more than 70% of the total trading value of the $4.3 trillion stock market. That's a lot. That is a lot. For the short term, at least, and maybe medium term, these two names and the associated ETFs are going to drive the Korean market. Okay, so what other things could they be worried about? Well, certainly the fighting in the Strait of Hormuz, but Brent is starting to slow down. Some big moves here last week, and then little slower yesterday, and now actually down a little bit today. So let's see how we finish. But certainly, risky to call it a short-term top here for sure, but slowing down. Gasoline and heating oil. Gasoline is up for the third straight day, but diesel is taking a dip, which is important for transportation. Fuel prices pops 3 cents after dropping about 3 cents, over the yesterday, over the last few days, but up 3 cents today. Let's get back over $4, and I think there'll be some concern. Okay, so Telegraph reports that the U.S. is launching rare daytime airstrikes in Hormuz, striking coastal defense systems and cruise missiles, and Greater Tun Island in the Strait. This is one of the islands where the Iranians are launching attacks on shipping. In response, Iran has launched missiles at U.S. military facilities in Kuwait, Jordan, and Bahrain. So far, just coastal regions, but President Trump has said that he's going to target Iranian infrastructure if Iran doesn't return to negotiations. Next week, it gets really bad for them. We're going to knock out all their power plants. We're going to knock out all their bridges unless they get to the table and negotiate. Remember, he threatened that before, and then 2 days later, I think in April, he said, we have a ceasefire. So let's see how serious he is. Most people think Trump would taco, but right now it seems something has changed. I still think it has something to do with the fact that he might have gotten intelligence that they were targeting him personally. The other thing that Trump was looking at, Telegraph also reporting, is there's Iran has hidden a nuclear fortress under something called a place called Pickaxe Mountain, which most people do not believe the American bombs can hit because it is so deep under granite. But he's threatened it, and we'll have to see how that goes. Telegraph thinks that hitting Pickaxe would be an escalation, would invite strikes, against other our Gulf allies. Okay, so this was really interesting, a big article in Telegraph, and I mean in some ways not entirely surprising, but in the western sort of Gobi Desert, China has mocked up replicas of basically a U.S. Arleigh Burke destroyer, among other things, aircraft carriers. And also a mock-up, as you can see, of the Yokosuka Naval Base in Japan, where the U.S. would probably stage from if they were going to defend Taiwan. So, I think this is a very good reason why countries across the world, especially in the Indo-Pacific and the Southern Pacific, are increasing their defense budgets because, if there is a problem in Taiwan, it could morph into something very much bigger than people might think. And, this tells you an interesting story. So Bloomberg reports that Anthropic is now looking to meet with investors ahead of a mega IPO, scheduling banks who are leading the offering are scheduling meetings and considering an IPO as soon as October October. That would put them ahead of OpenAI. OpenAI apparently has now pushed their IPO back to, probably the first quarter of 2027. And this would also get them ahead of DeepSeek. Now, I'm not sure, I don't think how big DeepSeek will be. I'm not really worried about DeepSeek. If you want to make money in, an IPO, a Chinese company, is not where you want to do it, right? Because if they show, first of all, DeepSeek is trying to undercut everybody's prices. So how much money they're going to really make, and they're Chinese. So I think their upside is really capped. So and what's important is Anthropic gets out ahead of OpenAI, which looks like it will do. They're still sort of the darling of the market. People think that, Anthropic really has the edge on OpenAI, particularly in coding. The other thing is they have a problem with the Trump administration, so you can't completely ignore that. So strike while the iron is hot, while people think that, they're doing really well, although their tokens are getting a little expensive. Anthropic was last valued at $965 billion after a funding round in May, and that put them ahead of the valuation for OpenAI, for the first time. So timing matters. Looks like Anthropic will get ahead of OpenAI in the IPO. And then this is kind of a big deal, but it's transparent to investors for now. JP Morgan, BlackRock, and Goldman are working with the Depository Trust Corporation to convert a batch of shares and treasuries into digital tokens in their first step towards a fully digital Wall Street. This is a trial run. They want to see how well it works. Now, formally, if it works fine, they're going to launch DTC is going to launch its tokenization program formally in October, and the companies can keep assets in the clearinghouse, in token form. And what's important with these tokenized stocks is they're basically real shares and can carry the same legal protection and dividends. They can only move between an approved number of financial institutions, and you can switch them back and forth, right? What's powerful here, it's going to make collateral transfers and repo transactions basically real time. You don't have to wait. You don't have to wait for trades to clear, things like that. It's going to make the whole thing a lot more efficient. So I think this is a big deal. It won't really impact the individual investor yet, but it's an important first step. And the DTC, safeguards more than 114 trillion in securities and processes a lot of stuff at almost $5 quadrillion last year. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you again tomorrow.